Let's imagine a scenario. The Gospels show us the birth and the episode of Jesus at 12 years old in the temple, impressing the wise men with his wisdom. But suddenly, the narrative about him enters into an almost absolute mystery until he resurfaces at 30 years old, baptized and ready for his public mission. But what happened during these years of silence? How could someone emerge as such a profound spiritual master if there are so few accounts of his upbringing? This gap sparks one of the greatest curiosities among historians, theologians, and spiritual seekers over the centuries. Today, we will explore what could have happened during the so-called lost years of Jesus, a period that becomes essential to understand the man and the mission he would become. The absence of official records from Jesus' youth years is a true enigma. In a time when scriptures, although rare, were meticulously documented, the lack of information raises deep questions. The Gospel of Luke mentions that Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and men, but this brief description leaves much to the imagination. After all, what exactly did this wisdom he was developing mean? And what experiences did he live through to shape such a deep and compassionate understanding of the human condition? Let's consider the historical and cultural context of his time. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, a small village in the region of Galilee, part of the Roman province of Judea. At that time, Palestine was a melting pot of cultures and influences. Jews, Romans, Greeks, and even echoes of Eastern philosophies crossed the deserts and ports of the region. This was a world filled with inequality, where Roman rule and differences between religious and cultural groups were part of everyday life. This environment would have shaped not only his worldview, but also his heart, deeply touched by the condition of the common people. In Jesus' childhood, we already see glimpses of his extraordinary future. The episode narrated in the temple at the age of 12 shows a young boy with an insatiable curiosity and an unusual thirst for spiritual knowledge. According to the account, he sat among the doctors of the law, asking questions that astonished with their depth. But soon after this scene, the narrative falls silent, and the journey of the young prodigy becomes a mystery, leaving a gap that generates fascinating theories about his development. To understand what might have happened, it's important to know what society expected from a young Jewish man at that time. In first-century Palestine, the lives of young people were guided by family tradition, faith, and manual labor. They were expected to follow their parents' trades and devote a large part of their lives to the study of the scriptures. It's reasonable to assume that Jesus would have received a basic education in the Torah, where he learned about the laws, the prophets, and the history of his people. But beyond this, his family was devout and possibly influenced by the spiritual traditions of Israel, which could have encouraged a deeper and more contemplative study of the scriptures. However, even considering the basic education he would have received, nothing seems sufficient to explain the uncommon wisdom he demonstrated when beginning his ministry. And this is where hypotheses about these lost years come into play. Some apocryphal texts, writings not included in the New Testament, such as the Gospel of Thomas, suggest that Jesus was already showing signs of an unusual spirituality from a very early age. These accounts, even though considered unofficial by the Church, raise questions about the possibility of a hidden preparation and contact with practices and knowledge beyond the Jewish tradition. This mystery is, in part, a reflection of the natural historical gaps of that time. Few documents have survived over the centuries, and those that do exist were often transmitted orally before being recorded. And even though the Bible is one of the most detailed collections of ancient texts, it's important to remember that it also reflects narrative choices and focus. In this sense, the omission of Jesus' lost years may have been intentional, perhaps to preserve the mystery or to concentrate the narrative on his public ministry. Whatever the reason, the fact is that this gap generates an almost magnetic attraction, a need to know what Jesus experienced and learned during this time of silence. Throughout the centuries, many theories have been developed to fill these gaps, some more plausible and others, perhaps, more speculative. Among these ideas are those suggesting that Jesus may have traveled to far-off places, such as Egypt and India, where he could have come into contact with profound spiritual traditions that shaped his view and understanding of the world. Other theories propose that he spent these years among the Essenes, a Jewish community known for its practices of purity and spiritual dedication. These hypotheses reflect the human eagerness to understand how someone could develop such universal and compassionate wisdom. With all these theories, the mystery only intensifies. The lack of exact details about these years allows each of us to project our own hopes and visions onto what Jesus lived and learned. Perhaps these years are, in fact, a period of intense preparation, a journey of self-discovery and spiritual growth that preceded his mission to transform the world. And as we reflect on this, we are led to think, how many of us also go through periods of silence and preparation before our greatest achievements? This is just an introduction to the complexity and fascination surrounding the lost years of Jesus. Now, with this backdrop in mind, let's move on to the most popular theories about what he might have experienced, where he went, and what he learned. In each hypothesis, we will find fragments that may help us decipher a little more about Jesus' inner and spiritual journey during these enigmatic years. One of the most intriguing theories about Jesus' lost years suggests that he could have traveled beyond the borders of Palestine in search of a broader and more universal spiritual wisdom. Imagine a young Jesus leaving his homeland and driven by an inner restlessness, setting off towards Egypt, one of the most important spiritual and esoteric knowledge centers of that time. This theory is based on the long Jewish tradition of refuge and learning in Egypt. Since Moses, Egypt was considered a place of spiritual transformation and connection with ancient mystical practices. If Jesus went through there, it's likely that he had contact with elements of Egyptian spirituality, absorbing influences that broadened his vision of the divine. This scenario suggests that Jesus would have taken advantage of the cultural and religious wealth that Egypt had to offer. Imagine him walking through temples and bustling cities, where spiritual traditions were not only complex, but filled with symbols that revealed secrets of the soul and eternity. Egypt was a land of profound mysteries, with schools teaching about life after death, the purification of the soul, and the connection with the divine. Many theorists believe that he could have been influenced by this atmosphere, shaping his perception of life and death, concepts that later appear with such depth in his ministry. Another fascinating aspect of this theory is the idea that Jesus could have gone even further, reaching as far as India. According to this hypothesis, he would have traveled through regions where Buddhist philosophy and Hindu teachings flourished, exposing him to traditions of compassion, detachment, and inner search. This idea, although controversial, is based on texts such as the Life of Saint Isa, a Tibetan manuscript that describes a prophet coming from the West. In this account, the prophet preaches love, peace, and respect for all life, values that strongly resonate with Jesus' teachings. This narrative has raised many questions about a possible Eastern influence on his life philosophy. India, with its meditation practices and teachings about karma and dharma, would have been a conducive environment for a young seeker like Jesus, interested in understanding the essence of being and the universe. In some traditions, it is believed that he may have met with spiritual masters who taught him about mind control and the understanding of spiritual laws that govern life. If he truly was in India, it's possible that he learned about the importance of inner peace, a central theme in his later message. This contact with Hindu and Buddhist masters could have enriched his worldview, especially in terms of universal love and detachment from material goods. The evidence in favor of this theory is, however, scarce. There are no concrete historical documents that prove Jesus was in Egypt or India during those years, and many scholars point to the lack of reliable records. On the other hand, there are certain elements in his teachings that refer to Eastern philosophies, especially when he talks about love for enemies and renunciation of material possessions, concepts that we also find in Hindu and Buddhist philosophies. For some, this similarity suggests an indirect influence or even a real visit to these places. There is, of course, significant resistance to this theory from traditional scholars and theologians who argue that Jesus' teachings are deeply rooted in Jewish scriptures, which would explain their originality without the need for external influence. However, the idea that he might have sought knowledge in other lands is not completely dismissed. After all, great spiritual masters from different times and cultures often traveled in search of more comprehensive wisdom. And, considering the impact of his message, it's plausible to imagine that Jesus might have desired to know other views of the divine to enrich his mission. But what would be the impact of these influences had they actually occurred? The theory suggests that Jesus returned to Palestine with a much broader spiritual vision, ready to be expressed through accessible metaphors and teachings. Exposure to Egyptian mysticism and Eastern philosophy could have contributed to the development of a message of universal love, something that transcends cultures and times. His teachings, such as the famous Sermon on the Mount, emphasize values that resonate with the idea of universal compassion and detachment. These concepts could have been enriched, directly or indirectly, by the wisdom of Eastern and Egyptian cultures. For many who study this period of Jesus' life, these influences do not diminish the originality of his message, but help to better understand how he became a teacher who captivated crowds and touched people's hearts, regardless of their origin or belief. A Jesus who traveled through distant lands, who absorbed various teachings, and then returned with an expanded wisdom, becomes an even more complex and fascinating figure. This period, then, could have been a phase of intense preparation, a path of deep learning before the final call. Although the evidence is indirect and often contested, the hypothesis of a journey to Egypt and India adds a layer of depth to the story of Jesus. This young seeker, driven by a thirst for wisdom, would have explored spiritual practices and traditions that shaped his vision and prepared him for what would become his great ministry. This scenario makes it possible for us to imagine that, amidst the silence of those years, he was, in fact, transforming internally, absorbing and integrating values that would echo in his teachings about love, compassion, and the kingdom of God. As we conclude this theory, we find ourselves faced with a central question again. Do we really need concrete evidence to understand Jesus' spiritual journey? Perhaps these lost years teach us about the importance of a period of seeking, learning, and preparation, something many of us also experience in our own lives. Just as he may have sought answers in distant lands, we too can draw inspiration from his quest for wisdom and self-knowledge. With that, we conclude this theory, but the journey is far from over. Next, we will explore another possibility: the connection between Jesus and the Essene community, a group of Jews dedicated to purity and intense spiritual life. Perhaps there, he may have found another essential piece for his formation and mission. In addition to theories that Jesus may have traveled to Egypt or India, an equally fascinating hypothesis suggests that he may have spent part of his silent years among the Essenes, an extremely devout and mystical community known for their isolated lifestyle, dedicated to spiritual purity and waiting for the Messiah. The Essenes inhabited the shores of the Dead Sea and lived in monastic communities that cultivated spirituality through simplicity and withdrawal from the world. It's tempting to imagine that Jesus, thirsty for knowledge and discernment, may have joined them, finding an environment that mirrored what would become an essential part of his message: devotion to God and the importance of love and purity. The life of the Essenes was marked by a continuous pursuit of purification, both spiritual and physical. They followed practices of daily ritual bathing, fasting, and a frugal lifestyle. According to some historical accounts, they were so rigorous in their discipline that they even lived in caves and distanced themselves from common life, dedicating themselves entirely to prayer, study, and meditation. For them, constant contact with the divine was essential, and the pursuit of inner enlightenment became the main mission. This deeply spiritual view could have been fertile ground for the young Jesus, who already showed a nature inclined towards divine service and unconditional love. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, brought to light texts that describe the life and precepts of the Essenes, and many scholars see in them possible connections with the teachings of Jesus. In various parts of these manuscripts, we find ideas of humility, love for enemies, and dedication to others, which later appeared in Jesus' teachings. The theory that he might have spent time with the Essenes gains strength when we consider that he, like them, also distanced himself from the dominant currents of the time, such as the Pharisees and Sadducees, to follow a path of love and compassion. If he truly lived with the Essenes, it's likely that he learned valuable lessons about spiritual discipline and self-sacrifice. This cohabitation would have provided him an opportunity to develop not only a strong sense of connection with God, but also a deep respect for nature, simplicity, and all living beings. This contact could have strengthened his conviction that the kingdom of God is not only in heavenly places, but in our ability to live purely and to nurture peace within us. Unlike other currents of the time, the Essenes believed that personal transformation was the path to redemption, a thought that would deeply resonate with Jesus' messages. The Essenes awaited the emergence of a Messiah who would liberate them from the oppressions of their time and usher in an era of divine justice. This messianic expectation may have impacted Jesus' own understanding of his mission. If he lived among them, it is possible that he intensely reflected on his role and his responsibility to the world. Instead of leading a political revolt, he may have realized that his mission would be a spiritual revolution. Thus, inspired by this experience, Jesus seems to have chosen a form of leadership that did not seek to overthrow physical empires, but to touch the heart and transform the minds of people. For the Essenes, the concept of community was sacred, and they believed in living as a large family of brothers and sisters, where everyone shared what they had, in a sort of ideal society. This communal principle aligns with Jesus' vision of love for one's neighbor and mutual aid. It's easy to imagine that this experience of communal living, focused on collective well-being, could have shaped his vision of a kingdom of God, where love, generosity, and mutual support are fundamental. Their practice of sharing and valuing the collective would resonate in his ministry, in which he invited people to unite around a common ideal of love and compassion. Furthermore, the Essenes were known for their knowledge of the scriptures and their respect for prophecies, something that could have deeply impacted the young Jesus. They spent long hours in study and prayer, seeking to understand God's promises and the coming of the Messiah. This practice of contemplation and study, geared towards revelation and spiritual enlightenment, could have been essential training for Jesus, not only in terms of theoretical knowledge, but also practical experience. The Essene view that each person has a role in the divine plan may have resonated deeply with Jesus, helping to strengthen his identity and mission. Even though there are no direct records of Jesus having lived among the Essenes, some scholars point to the similarities between the teachings of the Essenes and those of Jesus as indirect evidence of this coexistence. For example, the Essenes preached love for one's neighbor, the importance of forgiveness, and the practice of charity, themes that we see constantly reflected in Jesus' message. This viewpoint offers a perspective that he could have been not only an apprentice among the Essenes, but someone who absorbed and reshaped their values, elevating them to a more accessible and universal plane. Life among the Essenes may have also taught Jesus the importance of solitude, a significant aspect of his spiritual practice. This period of silence and seclusion allowed him to cultivate a deep connection with the Father, learning to value the power of silence and contemplation. We see that, even during his ministry, he often withdrew to pray and recharge, a habit that seems to indicate a deeply ingrained practice from his youth. These moments of withdrawal, as we see in the Essenes, could have been essential for him to maintain his clarity of purpose and inner peace. Finally, this theory leads us to reflect on the value of preparation and self-awareness in spiritual life. Living with the Essenes could have provided Jesus with a solid foundation, training not only in doctrine, but in lived experience. He may have learned that before touching people's lives, it was necessary to transform internally, dedicating himself to a life of purity, humility, and devotion. This period of preparation with the Essenes, if it occurred, was not wasted time, but a phase of polishing, character refinement, and strengthening of the mission he was destined to fulfill. This hypothesis about the years with the Essenes concludes with a question that provokes us. How many of us are willing to go through periods of seclusion and preparation in search of a greater mission? In silence, dedicated to practice and self-knowledge, we can find the strength for our own journey, just as, perhaps, Jesus found on the shores of the Dead Sea. The story with the Essenes shows us that every great mission begins within us, in the small disciplines and inner peace. Now, with this theory of the Essenes well explored, let's move on to the next phase of Jesus' lost years, his life as a carpenter. The simplicity of this profession and the impact it had on his human and spiritual formation may surprise us. The idea that Jesus spent part of his youth as a carpenter, practicing the manual trade learned from his father, Joseph, provides a fascinating and more human insight into those years. This period of craftsmanship, often considered a detail of little importance, may in fact have been essential for the development of his spirituality, shaping the character and humility he showed in his public life. Imagine Jesus in his workshop, handling wood, carving pieces, adjusting planks, and dedicating himself to daily work, while his thoughts and prayers likely blended with the rhythm of manual labor. At that time, carpentry was not a simple task, and carpenters played a significant role in the community. They built and repaired furniture, tools, and even elements of buildings. The skill and patience required to transform raw wood into a useful and beautiful object would surely have had a profound impact on Jesus' view of the world and human life. The constant practice of shaping wood and seeing a project take shape under his hands may have inspired his vision of the hidden potential in each person, an idea he would later apply in his teachings about the kingdom of God. This job also offered a lesson in humility and service. In a society where manual crafts were often underestimated, young Jesus grew up immersed in the simplicity of physical labor and the lessons it brought. Carpentry was a job that required discipline and patience, two qualities we would see reflected in his calm and firm demeanor when dealing with the challenges and trials he would face. This direct contact with the material world, the practice of creating something useful and enduring, might have been a form of preparation for his mission to transform the human soul, a transformation that, just like in carpentry, required time, effort, and dedication. The relationship with Joseph, his father, would also have been fundamental during these years of work. Joseph was not only Jesus' earthly father, but also his mentor and life example. Growing up alongside a righteous man, who taught as much by example as by words, must have profoundly shaped Jesus' character. Amidst carpentry work, Joseph could have imparted practical and spiritual teachings, instructing him not only about the craft, but also about how to be an honorable, respectful, and humble man. This coexistence with Joseph was undoubtedly a preparation for Jesus' role as a teacher who understood and respected the difficulties and daily life of ordinary people. This period of his life also raises an interesting reflection on the connection between work and spirituality. In manual labor, there is a purity and simplicity that often puts us in touch with something greater. Jesus, while working, probably found in these moments of concentration an opportunity for meditation and inner dialogue with God. In his profession, he could perceive the divine presence in creation and learn to value the small things, preparing himself to see the greatness of God in the details of everyday life. Carpentry might have been his form of active meditation, a time of introspection and internal construction while he was shaping the wood. Another point worth highlighting is Jesus' connection with the common people. Growing up as a carpenter meant being close to everyday people, understanding their needs and difficulties, sharing in their pains and hopes. By working with his own hands, he experienced the realities of the people and deeply understood the importance of each job, no matter how humble it was. This direct contact with the suffering and joys of the daily life of ordinary people would later make him a spiritual leader who connected with everyone, especially the marginalized and oppressed. Jesus was not a distant teacher, but someone who knew the difficulties and challenges of daily work. We can also imagine that carpentry taught Jesus the value of effort and perseverance. With each piece of wood he carved, he learned about the time each transformation requires, about the importance of precision and patience. In a world where changes often happen slowly, manual labor showed him that great achievements arise from small actions done with dedication. This understanding is reflected in his ministry when he talks about the importance of faith, the size of a mustard seed, capable of moving mountains. Carpentry may have been the foundation that helped him see the grandeur in every detail, teaching him to wait for the right time for each change. For Jesus, the act of transforming wood into something useful might have been a metaphor for the power of internal transformation. In his carpentry practice, he learned that with dedication and skill, it is possible to transform something raw into something beautiful and functional. This concept of transformation might have been the seed for many of his teachings about the human ability to change and redeem oneself. Jesus, who spent years working with wood, saw potential in every piece of raw material, just as he would see the potential in human souls, which could be polished and transformed for the good. This period in his life reinforces the idea that Jesus was in a process of continuous learning. He was not merely observing, but experimenting, growing, and incorporating what he experienced into his spiritual practice. Carpentry was a space where he found profound and daily lessons he would carry with him into his ministry, where he would speak simply about the kingdom of God, using metaphors that even the humblest could understand. By connecting with the people through his work, he was establishing the foundation of an accessible and compassionate message, grounded in his own life experience. Throughout the years as a carpenter, Jesus likely developed a compassionate and sensitive gaze, capable of seeing the divine in everything and everyone. This period of silence and manual labor allowed him to grow emotionally and spiritually before facing the challenges that were to come. Perhaps these years, when he worked alongside Joseph and lived in Nazareth, were crucial for the development of his empathy, his ability to forgive, and his love for his neighbor, characteristics so evident in his later teachings. This silence, often interpreted as an insignificant phase, was in fact a moment of refinement. While many sought power and glory, Jesus found greatness in every simple task, in every piece of furniture he built, in every interaction with the community. This carpentry life shaped the master he would become, someone who knew the realities of life and offered a path of redemption for all. Carpentry, with its simplicity and its lessons, may have been the fertile ground where the seed of his mission began to grow. With this, we conclude the theory on the impact of carpentry in your life. Now, we are ready to delve into the next phase of Jesus' lost years, the development of his spiritual gifts and his mystical preparation for the mission that was to come. What types of spiritual practices and trainings might he have experienced during these years? While many see Jesus as someone endowed with divine gifts from birth, some scholars and mystics suggest that he also underwent an intense process of spiritual development during his silent years. This period would have been marked by the practice of rigorous spiritual disciplines, such as meditation, fasting, and deep prayer, elements that could have strengthened and expanded his abilities, preparing him for the complexity of his mission. Imagine a young Jesus dedicating himself to long hours of contemplation, seeking a state of union with God that went beyond the ordinary, a state where revelation and understanding of life's mysteries could occur. These spiritual practices may have been essential in developing the gifts he would later demonstrate, such as healing, understanding the human soul, and the ability to discern what was beyond the visible. Meditation, for example, is a practice that calms the mind and allows consciousness to reach deeper levels of understanding. Jesus, in this sense, could have used meditation to achieve a direct and unfiltered connection with the Father, strengthening the spiritual bond that would be the foundation of all his teachings. The constant practice of this connection would have helped him develop his compassion, patience, and understanding, essential skills for his public life. Fasting is another powerful spiritual practice, and it is known that Jesus used fasting as a way to spiritually prepare himself. Later, he would spend 40 days in the desert, fasting before beginning his ministry, but it's likely that this practice started much earlier, perhaps during those silent years. Fasting, in addition to strengthening discipline and self-control, purifies the body and mind, allowing a person to fully focus on the spiritual dimensions of existence. Jesus may have found in fasting a means to transcend physical limitations, experiencing a deeper level of consciousness and preparation for the spiritual challenges he would face. Another essential element in this spiritual development could have been constant and intense prayer. Jesus is often described as someone who prayed deeply, often retreating in solitude to connect with the Father. These prayer practices were not mere rituals. For him, prayer was a direct channel of communion, where he sought guidance, strength, and wisdom. During the silent years, he likely developed a prayer practice so deep and intense that it allowed the opening of spiritual gifts and an unusual sensitivity to human needs, pain, and suffering. The development of these spiritual gifts was a process of refinement. It's possible that Jesus, during these years, explored and tested the limits of his own spirituality. Some theorists speculate that he may have begun performing small miracles, perhaps in secret, as a way to train and understand the power that was in his hands. It's a powerful idea to imagine a young Jesus learning to master and channel his ability to heal and show compassion, understanding the responsibility that this would entail. These gifts, once developed, would become one of the most striking features of his ministry, allowing him to heal the sick, resurrect the dead, and transform the lives of the people he encountered. There is also a mystical theory that suggests that Jesus, in his spiritual quest, had achieved a state of consciousness that allowed him to transcend the limitations of the common human mind. This state, according to some esoteric traditions, is called enlightenment, or Christ consciousness. He would have undergone such a profound inner transformation that enabled him to perceive the ultimate truth, to see beyond the illusions of the material world. This process of enlightenment is described in various spiritual traditions as a state of unity with the divine, where the ego disappears and only love and truth remain. For Jesus, this would mean an absolute commitment to compassion, truth, and unconditional love. If we think that Jesus, during these years of silence, was preparing himself spiritually, it's easy to understand why he sought solitude and seclusion. Isolation is often necessary for those who wish to delve deep into meditation and spiritual contemplation, as it allows a more direct connection with the divine, free from the distractions and demands of the outside world. This experience of seclusion and continuous prayer may have been what prepared him for the intense emotional and spiritual challenges he would face later when dealing with crowds, enemies, and rejection. Jesus was not the only spiritual teacher to seek a period of seclusion to develop spiritual gifts. Many masters throughout history underwent years of silent training before starting their public mission. This process of spiritual preparation would have helped him achieve deep self-knowledge, confront his own shadows, and develop the compassion that would later overflow to all who followed him. In this sense, Jesus is a powerful example that spiritual gifts are not just given, but are often cultivated with dedication, discipline, and silence. Another important aspect of developing these gifts is their use for the common good. Jesus, throughout his life, showed that the true spiritual gift is one that is in service to others. His ability to heal and comfort was not used to impress or to gain power, but to alleviate human suffering. In the years of silence, he would have learned that spiritual gifts should be used with humility and with a pure heart. This understanding is what set Jesus apart from other religious leaders of the time and gave his message a transformative power. It is also possible that Jesus, during these years, faced internal temptations and challenges, a necessary process for anyone seeking a deep understanding of their own spirituality. Just as in the episode of his temptation in the desert, Jesus may have gone through moments of doubt, questioning the meaning of his mission and the weight of his responsibility. These experiences would have been crucial in strengthening his faith and allowing him to emerge with unshakable confidence in his mission, ready to face the opposition and challenges that would come. Finally, these years of spiritual training and gift development can teach us a lot about the value of preparation time. Jesus showed that before exercising a gift, it is necessary to purify the heart and strengthen the spirit. The pursuit of enlightenment and connection with the divine requires patience, practice, and sincere dedication. These spiritual gifts, which he developed during the years of silence, are no different from the talents and abilities that we all can cultivate. They require discipline, humility, and a genuine desire to serve others. Thus, the theory of the development of Jesus' spiritual gifts during the lost years concludes with a profound lesson. True spiritual power is that which makes us more human, more compassionate, and more aware. Jesus, upon emerging from this period of silence, was prepared not only to perform miracles, but to touch people's hearts in a way that few people in history have been able to. And we, as we reflect on his journey, are invited to seek the same in our own lives, cultivating our gifts and putting them in service of love and compassion. We then conclude this theory. And now, let's move on to the next phase of Jesus' lost years, his emotional development and maturity, the transition from a young man to a spiritual master. As Jesus progressed through his silent years, he was not only developing spiritual gifts and practicing meditation, he was also undergoing an essential process of emotional and psychological maturation. These years were a crucial phase for him to learn how to deal with the complexities of human emotions, develop empathy, and reach a deep understanding of the pains and challenges that each human being faces. To fulfill the mission that lay ahead of him, Jesus would need more than spiritual wisdom. He would need an intimate understanding of human nature and the emotions each person carries within them. The emotional development of Jesus may have been intensified by his exposure to the hardships and injustices he witnessed around him. First-century Palestine was a land of deep inequalities, where poverty, Roman oppression, and religious divisions caused pain and suffering. As a young man, Jesus would have seen the consequences of abusive power and the marginalization of the weakest. These experiences not only made him sensitive, but also strengthened his desire to transform society and bring a message of love and equality. He knew that his mission would require a firm yet compassionate heart, capable of enduring the anguish of a people yearning for redemption. During these years, Jesus might have learned to recognize and deal with his own emotions, a crucial process for anyone seeking to lead and inspire others. Managing one's emotions allows for inner stability, necessary to maintain peace and clarity amidst chaos. Jesus, through prayer, contemplation, and manual labor, likely developed a deep connection with his emotions, learning to observe and understand what he felt. This practice of self-awareness would later assist him in being an example of peace and serenity, even in times of extreme pressure. This period also offered Jesus the chance to develop his empathy and compassion on a profound level. He knew human suffering not just from hearing about it, but because he saw and experienced it daily. This closeness with the people, with their dilemmas and their sorrows, was a practical learning that helped him understand the needs and frailties of each person. Jesus, who would later preach about loving one's neighbor and forgiveness, did not do this from a distant perspective. He spoke of a real love, one that understands pains and welcomes difficulties. This emotional learning was essential for him to carry the message of redemption in a genuine and empathetic way. As he developed his emotional maturity, Jesus also discovered the importance of resilience. In a world where rejection and criticism were common for those who challenged the status quo, he would have to prepare to endure judgments, misunderstandings, and even betrayals that he would face later. These years of silence served as psychological preparation, helping him to find an inner strength that would sustain him when the time came for his public mission. He learned to become an unshakable pillar, someone who, even in the face of adversity, would not abandon his principles and his mission. This emotional resilience also allowed him to develop an incredible capacity for forgiveness, forgiving not only those who would harm him in the future, but forgiving human weaknesses in general, understanding them as part of everyone's journey. He knew that people make mistakes and act impulsively, often driven by fear, anger, or ignorance. This deep understanding of human emotions led him to create a message of forgiveness and reconciliation, capable of touching even the hardest of hearts. This emotional maturity, developed over the years, was what made his forgiveness authentic and transformative. Another important aspect of his emotional growth was self-compassion. Jesus, over these years, may have learned to treat himself with kindness and understand his own limitations. This self-compassion is not a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of emotional balance. He knew that in order to love and forgive others, it was first necessary to accept and love himself. This practice of self-compassion would have been crucial in maintaining his inner peace, even in the face of trials and difficulties that would arise in the future. The transition from a young person to a spiritual master inevitably involves a great deal of suffering and challenge. Many spiritual masters have gone through periods of crisis which were fundamental to their growth. Jesus, in these silent years, may have faced moments of doubt, questioning his mission and what he should do with the knowledge and wisdom he was developing. These crises of faith and purpose are normal for those seeking a deep spiritual path, and it was by facing these issues that he solidified his conviction and his determination to follow his calling. However, Jesus' emotional maturation did not mean a passive acceptance of the injustices he saw around him. On the contrary, he developed a passion for justice and a revolt against the oppressions he witnessed. This indignation was balanced by his wisdom and compassion, but it gave him the strength to challenge religious and political authorities, defending those who were wronged. Jesus was preparing himself to be a steadfast voice in defense of the marginalized, and his emotional maturity enabled him to face the consequences of his actions with serenity and conviction. As Jesus matured emotionally, he also developed an increasingly clearer vision of what it meant to love unconditionally. This love was not just a superficial feeling, but a profound decision to see the divine in every person, to accept and welcome each one, regardless of their flaws or merits. This unconditional love would be the foundation of his ministry, a love that made no distinctions and embraced even sinners and outcasts. This love was the fruit of a mature heart, which had learned to overcome pride, judgment, and ego. This period of emotional maturation also shaped the way Jesus would deal with suffering. He understood that pain is part of the human experience and that everyone, in some way, faces losses and sorrows. His sensitivity to human suffering enabled him to offer comfort and healing in a way that few were capable of. He would become the man of sorrows, not just because he would face his own pain, but because he would understand and embrace the pain of others. This deep compassion and understanding of suffering were developed in the silent years, when he reflected on the human condition and on the power of love and forgiveness. Upon completing these years of emotional and spiritual growth, Jesus emerged as a man of great maturity and balance, someone prepared to endure the trials and challenges that his mission would bring. He was not just a master of spiritual wisdom. He was someone who deeply understood the human heart, who knew that before healing physical wounds, it was necessary to heal the wounds of the soul. His emotional and spiritual development were complete, and he was ready to embark on the path that would make him one of the greatest examples of love and compassion in human history. This process of emotional and spiritual maturation reminds us that, before embarking on great missions, one must be emotionally prepared for the difficulties that will arise. Jesus showed us that compassion, resilience, and unconditional love are built through deep and sincere work, which involves understanding and accepting oneself and others. With his journey of emotional growth completed, he was ready to start the path that would change the course of history. And now, let's move on to the next part, where we will discuss Jesus' final preparation for his public ministry, the moment when he begins to emerge from years of silence and responds to the call to transform the world. After years of preparation, Jesus was finally ready to answer the call that echoed in his heart. This phase of transition from the years of silence to the start of his public ministry was marked by a profound awakening, where he felt that the time had come to share his vision and fulfill the mission he had so deeply contemplated and prepared for. He emerged from a period of intense spiritual practices, manual work, emotional development, and self-discovery, ready to transform the lessons and gifts he had cultivated into actions that would touch the world around him. The first step was the meeting with John the Baptist, a prophet who preached the necessity of repentance and who baptized people as a symbol of purification and rebirth. Jesus, despite being someone so spiritually advanced, decided to be baptized by John. This act of humility and identification with the people marked the beginning of his public journey. By descending into the waters of the Jordan, he stood alongside those seeking inner transformation, and this moment would become a milestone in his life. Baptism was, for Jesus, an act of complete surrender to the Father and an acceptance of his mission, confirmed by the words that echoed, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." This encounter with John was not only a symbolic preparation, but also a connection with the spiritual renewal movement that was emerging at the time. John the Baptist was paving the way for something greater, and by associating with him, Jesus was, in a way, indicating that he would carry on this work, but on a broader and deeper level. John's presence, his strength and charisma, perhaps served as a final inspiration for Jesus, who would henceforth assume a leadership role, but with an approach of love and compassion that was even more profound and revolutionary. After baptism, Jesus was taken to the desert, where he spent 40 days fasting and praying. This period of isolation was a time of confrontation with his own temptations and limitations, and is described in the Gospels as a time of trial. In the desert, he faced the temptations of power, wealth, and self-sufficiency, and these trials were not just symbolic, but real. Jesus knew that to fulfill his mission, he would need to resist all human temptations that could divert his attention and purpose. Each choice he made during this period reaffirmed his devotion to God and his determination to follow a path of humility and service, rejecting material values and the traps of ego. Upon leaving the desert, Jesus was ready to begin his ministry, with unshakable clarity about his mission and the principles that would guide him. He began to gather disciples, people who would accompany him and learn directly from him. These first followers were mostly simple men, workers and fishermen, who led humble lives and were thirsty for something greater. The choice of his disciples reflects Jesus' connection with the common people and his desire to reach those who most needed hope and redemption. He was not seeking intellectuals or religious leaders, but men of faith and open hearts, willing to transform their lives. Jesus' first steps as a teacher were taken with simplicity and depth. He began teaching in small villages and synagogues, using accessible and direct language so that anyone could understand and apply his teachings. His message was clear. The kingdom of God was within everyone's reach, and it was built on love, forgiveness, and justice. This vision of the kingdom was revolutionary, as it brought accessible hope and challenged religious and political authorities, who ruled through fear and oppression. Jesus spoke of a kingdom of peace and compassion, where every human being was valuable and loved by God. An interesting point of this ministry's beginning was the choice of Galilee as the place where he would start preaching. Galilee was a marginalized region, far from power centers and less influenced by the religious elites of Jerusalem. This choice demonstrated that Jesus wanted to bring his message primarily to the forgotten and the excluded, a decision that showed his affinity with those who suffered. He believed that the kingdom of God was not something reserved for an elite, but a truth accessible to all, especially those living on the fringes of society. This decision reflected his commitment to a message of inclusion and hope. Jesus also began to perform healings and miracles, demonstrating not only his spiritual power, but also his compassion for the sick and afflicted. These healings were more than mere acts of power. They were a manifestation of his love and his mission to restore people's dignity. Each miracle he performed was a living message that God was near, caring for, and restoring those who were rejected by society. These healings also symbolize the inner healing, forgiveness, and transformation he wanted to bring to everyone. Through each miracle, he showed that God's love was available to heal the deepest wounds. This initial period of preaching and healing served to establish Jesus' reputation as a different kind of teacher, someone who was not bound by the rigid religious rules of the time. He often confronted religious authorities, challenging the norms that made religion a heavy burden for the people. Jesus rejected the excesses and hypocrisies of religious leaders and offered an accessible path of faith based on love and compassion. This behavior earned him both admirers and enemies, but he remained steadfast in his vision of authentic and liberating spirituality. The formation of a community around him was a fundamental step for the development of his ministry. Jesus didn't just want followers, but a true spiritual family, where everyone would support each other and live the values he taught. He encouraged generosity, mutual support, and sharing, creating a new way of living in community. This group of disciples and followers would be the basis for the movement that would later spread throughout the world, carrying the message of love and hope that he planted in every heart. This community was, in essence, a seed of the kingdom of God that he proclaimed. However, the path of Jesus would not be easy. The growth of his popularity and his challenging message began to attract the attention of the authorities, who saw him as a threat to the established order. He knew that the journey would be difficult, and that many would oppose his message. But strengthened by years of preparation and the certainty of his mission, he continued to teach with courage and compassion. Each step he took was an affirmation of his faith and unwavering commitment to love and truth, regardless of the consequences. This beginning of ministry was a moment of consolidation, where everything he had learned and developed during the years of silence was transformed into action and service to others. Jesus had finally emerged from anonymity to fulfill the calling he had felt in his heart. He was prepared to face the pains and challenges that would come, and was determined to spread a message of hope and redemption that would impact the world. With this preparation phase completed, Jesus was ready to embark on his journey of love and transformation. He knew that his mission would require sacrifice and faith, but also that, through it, he could touch lives and bring a piece of God's kingdom into the heart of everyone he met. Now, he was fully committed to the calling, ready to spread a message that would echo through eternity. Thus, we conclude the preparation for your public ministry. Next, in the following part, we will explore the lessons that these lost years of Jesus can teach us and the lasting impact of this silent journey on his mission. Upon concluding our journey through the lost years of Jesus, a natural reflection emerges. What can these years of silence, training, and preparation teach us today? Although few records exist about this period of his life, the lessons he leaves us transcend time and offer profound insights for those seeking a path of purpose, compassion, and self-awareness. First and foremost, these lost years show us the importance of preparation before a major mission. Jesus spent years dedicating himself to spiritual, emotional, and physical development before starting his public ministry. This time of preparation teaches that true purpose requires patience, self-awareness, and internal work. Before launching into the world, a period of silence is necessary, where we delve into our own truth and cultivate the skills and strength that will allow us to face future challenges. Jesus shows us that greatness does not arise from haste, but from maturity. These years also reveal the value of self-awareness and connection with our emotions. Jesus not only developed spiritual gifts, but he also intensely worked on his emotional maturity, learning how to deal with pain, compassion, and forgiveness. In a world that often invites us to hide our emotions, Jesus shows us that emotional self-awareness is essential for those who wish to transform lives. He reminds us that true leadership and compassion are born from a heart that knows itself and has learned to overcome its own shadows. Another powerful lesson from Jesus' lost years is the importance of being in touch with the real world and ordinary people. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, living a simple life dedicated to manual labor, far from the centers of power and wealth. This time spent among the people, experiencing the struggles and challenges of everyday life, enabled him to deeply connect with others. He knew what it was like to live a life of simplicity and humility, and this experience shaped his empathy and desire to help the marginalized. Simplicity and humility allow us to see beyond our own interests and find an authentic connection with others. The practice of silence and meditation, which Jesus likely cultivated during those years, is also a valuable lesson. In a society that constantly invites us to seek distractions and occupations, he teaches us that silence is essential for discovering purpose and inner peace. Through silence, he developed a deep connection with the divine and a clarity about his mission that would guide him throughout his life. This period of introspection and solitude is a reminder that, to hear the call of our purpose, it is necessary to disconnect from distractions and seek a space for inner contemplation. The lost years of Jesus also teach us that compassion is the foundation of every great mission. He learned to love and forgive not only from what he read or heard, but through a consistent practice of empathy and understanding of human weaknesses. His message of unconditional love and forgiveness is the result of years of inner work, where he learned to see the divine in every person, regardless of their flaws. This compassionate view invites us to develop the ability to welcome and forgive, understanding that we all face struggles and challenges. Another inspiring point is the commitment to truth. Jesus, during his years of preparation, developed an unshakable clarity about his mission and the values that would guide him. He knew he would face resistance and persecution, but his journey of self-discovery and connection with God strengthened him to move forward, regardless of the consequences. This commitment to truth teaches us the importance of staying true to our principles, even when the path becomes difficult. Truth, when rooted in love and compassion, has the power to transform lives and inspire lasting changes. Jesus' dedication to service is also a central lesson from these years of preparation. He understood that his spiritual gifts were not just for him, but for the benefit of all. In the lost years, he cultivated humility and a willingness to serve, qualities that would make him an approachable and genuine spiritual teacher. This understanding that our talents and abilities should be put at the service of others is a call that still resonates today. He teaches us that true power lies in the ability to offer our skills to alleviate suffering and promote the common good. These years of silence also reinforce the idea that the spiritual journey is personal and that everyone has their own pace of growth and maturation. Jesus took years to be fully prepared for his mission, and this development process reminds us that spiritual growth cannot be rushed. Each stage is important, and each lesson along the way prepares us for the next phase. This lesson is an invitation to respect our own rhythm, trusting that, in its own time, everything will fall into place. Another significant point is Jesus' ability to live in a state of gratitude and simplicity. In a life marked by manual labor and contact with simple people, he found beauty and meaning in small things. This practice of gratitude and appreciation for the everyday helped him see the presence of God in everything and everyone, making his message of love and acceptance even more powerful. Gratitude is a key to a fulfilling life, and Jesus teaches us to find purpose and fulfillment in the simplest things. Finally, these lost years show us that the greatest purpose of our life is love. Jesus, in his years of preparation, cultivated such a deep and pure love that would sustain him at every moment of his mission. This love is what gives meaning to our existence and is the basis of all true transformation. Jesus' life is a testimony that love is the answer to life's deepest questions, and that when guided by it, we can achieve accomplishments that transcend time. We thus conclude our journey through the lost years of Jesus. These silent years, although without detailed records, are a fundamental part of his story and his preparation for the impact he would have on the world. They remind us that to accomplish great things, we must first transform within, that simplicity and compassion are pillars of a meaningful life, and that silence and contemplation are essential to finding our true mission. May the lessons from these years of silence inspire us to seek our own purpose with patience, compassion, and love. For as Jesus showed us, true spiritual power does not lie in the extraordinary, but in the love we are capable of sharing and the peace we cultivate within ourselves. So, Mind Unfettered, now it's your turn. I want to hear from you in the comments. Given everything we've explored about Jesus' lost years, what do you believe he learned or experienced during this time that prepared him for the mission he undertook? Share your thoughts or feelings on the topic. By commenting, you join a community of seekers who, just like you, are in a process of discovering, learning, and expanding. And don't stop here. On the screen, you'll find the next video, where we're going to dive into a new fascinating aspect of Jesus' life. Jesus and the Kabbalah, unveiling the hidden mysticism behind Christ's teachings. Get ready to uncover the possible connections between Jesus' teachings and the Kabbalah, and how this mystical wisdom can reveal a new layer of meaning in his message. Let's embark on this journey of self-discovery and expansion together.